John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts, into one of the most prominent families in American politics and business. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., was a wealthy businessman and U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, and his mother, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, came from a family with deep political roots in Boston. John, known as Jack to his family and friends, grew up in a household filled with ambition, competition, and the constant reminder that he and his siblings were destined for great things. From an early age, Jack's life was marked by both privilege and struggle. He attended private schools and traveled extensively, but he also faced recurring health problems. Throughout his childhood and young adulthood, he suffered from illnesses that would follow him all his life, from scarlet fever to chronic back pain and later Addison's disease. These health issues forced him to be resilient, and his determination to overcome them would shape his character. Jack attended Choate, an elite boarding school, where he earned a reputation as charming, witty, and mischievous. He was not the top student, but he was intellectually curious and loved history and politics. In 1935, he briefly enrolled at Princeton University but had to leave due to illness. Later, he joined Harvard University, where he began to flourish. At Harvard, he wrote his senior thesis on Britain's unpreparedness for World War II, which was later published as a book titled, Why England Slept, earning him recognition as a thoughtful young scholar. His years at Harvard cemented his interest in global politics, particularly the looming conflict in Europe. After graduating in 1940, Kennedy traveled through Europe, observing firsthand the growing tensions and dangers posed by Nazi Germany. These experiences deepened his belief in the need for American engagement in world affairs. When the United States entered World War II, Kennedy joined the U.S. Navy. In 1943, while commanding a patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific, his vessel, PT-109, was struck by a Japanese destroyer. Despite serious back injuries, Kennedy led his surviving crew to safety, towing one wounded sailor through miles of water. For his heroism, he received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. This event turned him into a war hero and would later become a cornerstone of his political career. After the war, however, Jack's health deteriorated again, forcing him to undergo multiple operations. At times, his condition was so severe that last rites were administered by priests, yet he continued to fight back, showing a remarkable will to live. After the war, Kennedy considered a career in journalism but soon turned to politics, encouraged by his ambitious father. In 1946, he ran for Congress as a Democrat from Massachusetts and won, beginning his journey in the House of Representatives. He served 3 terms, gaining a reputation as an independent thinker and a man deeply interested in foreign. When John F. Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, America was at a crossroads. The country was powerful and prosperous, yet deeply divided. The Cold War with the Soviet Union defined global politics, racial tensions at home were boiling over, and the pace of technological change was accelerating. Kennedy's youth, charm, and optimism gave the impression of a fresh beginning, but behind the glamour lay immense pressures that tested his leadership and shaped his fate. His presidency would last less than 3 years, but within that brief time he faced crises that could have destroyed nations and opportunities that could have reshaped society. One of his earliest challenges was the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. It was a plan inherited from the Eisenhower administration, in which Cuban exiles trained by the CIA would invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. Kennedy approved the operation, but it was poorly executed. The invaders were quickly defeated, and the debacle embarrassed the young president on the world stage. Many critics thought Kennedy was weak, while allies doubted his resolve. Kennedy himself felt humiliated, but he learned from the mistake. He began to distrust the military and intelligence establishment, relying more on his own judgment and a close circle of advisors. The failure in Cuba, however, planted seeds of hostility between Kennedy and the CIA, which some later speculated could be connected to his assassination. At the very least, it created enemies within powerful institutions. In June 1961, Kennedy met Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. The summit was tense and unproductive, with Khrushchev seeing Kennedy as inexperienced. The Soviet leader tested him soon after by building the Berlin Wall, symbolizing the division of East and West. Kennedy responded cautiously, reinforcing U.S. forces in Europe while avoiding direct military confrontation. Then, in October 1962, came the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. U.S. intelligence discovered that the Soviets were installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. Military leaders urged an immediate strike, but Kennedy chose a naval blockade and careful negotiations. For 13 days the world held its breath, fearing nuclear war. At the end, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. Kennedy's handling of the crisis was seen as a triumph of restraint and diplomacy. Yet it also deepened the hatred of some hardliners who believed he was too soft on communism. At home, Kennedy's presidency intersected with the rising civil rights movement. African Americans were demanding equal rights, and activists were staging protests, sit-ins, and marches across the South. Kennedy initially moved cautiously, fearing to alienate Southern Democrats, whose support he needed in Congress. But as events escalated, the death of John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, marked a turning point in American history. The shock was immediate and overwhelming. Across the country, televisions and radios carried the news, and people wept openly in public. Schools dismissed classes, businesses closed, and church bells rang. Americans felt as though the nation itself had been struck down. For millions, Kennedy had embodied a spirit of youth, courage, and idealism. To see that vision violently extinguished in broad daylight shattered faith in government and in the idea that progress was inevitable. The grief was personal, yet it was also political and cultural, leaving scars that would last for decades. The days following the assassination were filled with ritual and mourning. Kennedy's body was flown back to Washington, where it lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Hundreds of thousands of citizens waited in long lines through cold November nights to pay their respects. Jackie Kennedy, still dignified in her mourning, became a symbol of grace. She insisted that her husband be remembered as a heroic figure, comparing his presidency to King Arthur's Camelot. This imagery resonated deeply, cementing the idea that Kennedy's brief presidency was a golden age tragically cut short. The funeral on November 25, attended by world leaders and watched by millions around the globe, was a moment of shared grief and unity. Images of John Jr., Kennedy's 3-year-old son, saluting his father's coffin became iconic. Yet behind the ceremonies, questions lingered about how and why the assassination had happened. The official investigation, led by the Warren Commission, concluded in 1964 that Harvey Oswald had acted alone in killing Kennedy. According to the report, Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, striking Kennedy twice and Governor Connally once. Jack Ruby's killing of Oswald was explained as an act of impulsive anger. Yet many Americans found the report unconvincing. The single bullet theory, which claimed that one bullet caused multiple wounds to both Kennedy and Connally, seemed implausible to skeptics. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts of how many shots they heard and from which direction. Some believed shots came from the grassy knoll, suggesting a second gunman. The abrupt silencing of Oswald by Ruby added to suspicions of a cover-up. Over time, the assassination became the subject of countless books, films, and debates. Polls consistently showed that most Americans believed there had been a conspiracy, though opinions differed on who was responsible. Various theories emerged. Some suspected that the CIA had orchestrated the assassination because Kennedy had clashed with intelligence officials after the Bay of Pigs and during the Cold War. Others pointed to the mafia, angered by the Kennedy administration's crackdown on organized crime despite alleged earlier ties between Joseph Kennedy and mob figures.